Chapter 3. The Politics. The politics of any nation under foreign occupation becomes complex and precarious. The political tensions within Israel in Jesus' day were significant and can be missed with a casual reading of the Bible. Each clique and political faction had their own interests, the least influential among them being the common Israeli citizen. The ideal of Israel as a theological monarchy had been lost due to a long history of corrupt, often maniacal, political, and religious leaders. The nation was further oppressed by a sometimes harsh Roman military occupation. Common people struggled to survive, suppressed by a heavy tax burden from both their own countrymen as well as from Rome. In the midst of their struggles, however, the common citizen held on to a belief that God would ultimately free their country. How God would deliver Israel was less clear. Many believed the pathway to freedom was through armed resistance. The common citizen, a small minority of people, comprised the ruling class in Jesus' time. Common citizens were referred to as people of the land, the Am Haaretz, and had no particular distinction or social standing. When self-aggrandizing was in order, the Am Haaretz were an easy target to discriminate against. The Am Haaretz were thought of as the uneducated lower rungs of society. Jesus and his followers were included. On one occasion, Pharisees ordered the arrest of Jesus, but the temple guard failed to do so. The Pharisees chided the soldiers for being easily deceived, just like the uneducated and low-class people that followed Jesus. From John's Gospel. Then the officers returned to the chief priests and Pharisees, who said to them, "Why didn't you bring him back with you?" The officers replied, "No one ever spoke like this man." Then the Pharisees answered, "You haven't been deceived too, have you? None of the rulers or the Pharisees have believed in him, have they? But this rabble who do not know the law are accursed." John 7:45-49. This rabble, namely the common people that followed Jesus, were considered accursed by the religious and socially elite. Israel in Jesus' time was an agrarian society. The common people were typically farmers, truly people of the land. No wonder Jesus often used farming parables in his teachings. For example, Matthew 13:3-8, and Mark 4:26-29. The common person's day-to-day life was about labor, trying to maintain the home, family, and pay their heavy tax burden. The Romans. By the time Jesus was born, Caesar Augustus had consolidated his hold on Roman rule. Augustus was the nephew and adopted son of Julius Caesar. After Julius was assassinated in 44 BC, Augustus was able to consolidate power and secure his rule of the Roman Empire through a complex sequence of events. The Roman Senate had lost much of its power and became more or less window-dressing to give the appearance of an ongoing republic. Ultimate authority rested with Caesar. This was not fully unwelcomed, since it diminished political infighting and ostensibly restored the republic. Roman military might was well known and feared. Augustus had created a standing army of 150,000 legionaries, plus auxiliary infantry and cavalry of 180,000 stationed throughout the empire. Augustus understood that to maintain control of the empire, plus seek further expansion, could deplete military resources and potentially threaten the stability of the empire. He therefore recommended against ongoing imperialism and military conquest. With Augustus and his policies came a prolonged period of stability known as the Pax Romana, Latin for Roman peace, which lasted nearly 2 centuries. The moniker Pax Romana had some propaganda-like qualities, since peace was maintained by iron-fisted rule and depended on Roman military strength and presence. Rome governed regions of the empire through governors or legates. Subordinate to the governors were proconsuls, typically of the equestrian class. Augustus divided the empire into 32 regions. Politically stable regions were governed by proconsuls, who answered to the Senate and did not have military power. Where political instability or revolutionary elements were present, procurators, legates, governed larger regions and prefects smaller regions. Procurators and prefects had civil and military authority, were answerable directly to Caesar, and were to rule by Roman law. Whenever possible, Rome utilized local leadership. Client kingdoms, such as Israel, were allowed self-governance to a point, and received Roman protection in exchange for taxation, military control, and submission to Roman law as the final authority. By the time Jesus was born, the Romans had established alliances with Herod the Great and his family. Rome also exercised influence over the high priest and the Sanhedrin. Herod the Great ruled as king of Israel from 37 BC until his death. Second to Caesar, he was the richest man in the Mediterranean. He was Phoenician by ancestry, embraced Greek culture, was Roman by citizenship, but he was the king of Israel and Jewish by religion. He read Deuteronomy, the Hebrew law, in the temple every 7 years, and appointed the high priest. He further secured his control over the high priesthood by keeping the priestly garments in his possession. He was reputed to be arrogant, calculating, and ruthless. Herod was able to maintain a favorable relationship with Rome and continue to rule in Israel as monarch. He personally commanded his own multinational army, estimated to be 15,000 soldiers. This allowed him to maintain cohesion and stability throughout his kingdom. As a client kingdom of Rome, Herod's army also served as auxiliary forces for the Roman army. Herod also had a Praetorian guard of 2,000 men for personal security. Herod exhibited Stalin-like paranoia and ruthlessness. Killing anyone deemed suspicious or untrustworthy was typical. After having his first wife, Mariamne, executed, Herod mourned with apparent mental repression of the facts, asking servants to search for her. He was noted to mourn for her with loud weeping. He later remarried 8 times, plus kept a harem of 500. Toward the end of his life, Herod was in ill health and suffered from progressive mental illness, perhaps dementia. The cruelty of Herod's personality is attested to in the New Testament. Shortly after Jesus' birth, 3 magi inquired of Herod where the King of the Jews had been born, telling him that they had followed a star to Jerusalem to see the child. This kindled Herod's paranoia, perceiving a possible threat to familial succession to his throne. Herod was furious after the Magi secretly departed the country without notifying him of the baby Jesus' whereabouts. Herod's reaction was to have all boys in Bethlehem under the age of 2 years killed. Matthew 2, 1-18. Herod's pride was the temple he built in Jerusalem. His aim was to have a legacy the magnitude of King Solomon's. Herod's temple was a massive undertaking requiring 80 years to complete. He utilized Roman engineering and Egyptian building technology to build what became a wonder in the ancient world. Herod's sons. After his death, Herod's kingdom was divided among his 3 sons. Archelaus was given rule over Samaria and Judea, but was replaced in 6 AD by a Roman procurator due to his incompetency and harsh dealing with the Jews. Philip, given the title Tetrarch, ruled over the region northeast of the Sea of Galilee. Herod Antipas, also referred to as Herod the Tetrarch in the New Testament, ruled over Galilee in the north and the region east of the Jordan River. Herod Antipas created controversy when he married his half-brother's wife, while the half-brother was still living. This was a violation of Jewish law. John the Baptist publicly denounced him for this, which resulted in John's imprisonment and eventual execution. Matthew 14, 3-12. Jesus referred to Herod Antipas as a fox when he heard that Antipas was plotting to kill him also, Luke 13, verse 32. Paradoxically, Herod Antipas heard of Jesus' miracles and wanted to meet him. Herod Antipas only met Jesus once, the morning of his crucifixion, Luke 9, 7-9, and Luke 23, 6-9. The Herodians. The Gospels refer to a group called Herodians. They are thought to have been pro-Roman Hellenistic Jews, with close ties to the Herod dynasty during the time of Antipas. They may have been extended family members or cronies, and seem to have comprised a political faction or ad hoc political party. Pharisees and Herodians had formed some kind of political alliance. At one point, Herodians conspired with Pharisees seeking a way to kill Jesus, Mark 3, verse 6. On another occasion, Pharisees and Herodians jointly attempted to snare Jesus on the question of whether or not it was legitimate for Jews to pay taxes to Caesar. Any yes or no answer would certainly have incensed the crowd. Sensing their treachery, Jesus famously answered, "Give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Mark 12, verse 17. The high priest. In Jewish tradition, the office of high priest began with Aaron, the brother of Moses, who was appointed by God himself. Succession of the high priestly office was supposed to transition to Aaron's descendants, Exodus 29, 4-9. Originally, the high priest's office was a lifetime appointment, Numbers 35, verse 25 and verse 28. The high priest was the ultimate ecclesiastical authority in Israel. By Jesus' time, however, the high priest was an appointed job without regard to ancestral lineage and had rapid turnover directed by political leaders. Between 37 BC and 70 AD, there were 78 high priests, typically appointed from aristocratic families. Historically, the most famous was Joseph Caiaphas, who was high priest when Jesus was crucified. In the first century, the high priest's office was dominated by a handful of wealthy families. It was a prized position of influence and self-enrichment corrupted by greed and nepotism. Appointment was obtained by bribery. The high priest's family could obtain enormous wealth profiting from the general population through the temple tax, graft, managing the concessions in the temple, stealing from the temple treasury, taking tithes, monetary contributions belonging to lower-level priests, and profiting from the sale of skins of sacrificial animals. To those in control of the temple, opportunities for wealth seemed endless. An estimated 300,000 to 500,000 lambs were sacrificed annually at Passover in Jesus' time. Since a lamb was intended to provide for 10 people at the Passover feast, it is estimated that 3 to 5 million people were in Jerusalem for the Passover festival. Passover, as well as other festivals and religious services, offered huge potential for profit for ruling priestly families. The Sanhedrin. The tradition of a 70-member governing body of elders dates back to the time of Moses, Numbers 11:16. The Sanhedrin was presided over by the high priest. The Sanhedrin had both civil and religious authority. It had its own police force, the temple guard, and court system. The Sanhedrin was comprised of two sects, Sadducees and Pharisees. About 80% of the Sanhedrin were Sadducees. The Sadducees were more influential, but the Pharisees were considered orthodox and were more admired by the general public. The influence of the Sanhedrin varied through time. When Herod the Great came to power, he executed 45 members of the Sanhedrin. This eliminated the old nobility of the Sanhedrin and sent a chilling message of intimidation to newly appointed members. Sanhedrin influence was perhaps at its weakest during the reign of Herod the Great. The Sadducees. There is no record in the Gospels of any Sadducee being sympathetic or accepting of Jesus. The Sadducees were politically well-placed and had the backing of those with wealth and power. Sadducees were considered rude and argumentative. They were also more severe in rendering judgment and punishment than the Pharisees. Sadducees accepted only the written law, rejecting other sacred writings or oral traditions. They also had their own beliefs and interpretations of religious protocol. Sadducees did not accept the idea of an end-time resurrection of the dead, a commonly held belief in Jesus' time, Mark 12, verse 18, Luke 20, verse 27, and Matthew 22, verse 23. Unlike the Pharisees, they did not adhere to Jewish religious traditions outside the written law, Mark 7, verse 3. They considered God largely dissociated from the affairs of mankind. Their disbelief in an end-time resurrection excluded any consideration of fate, eternal judgment, or anything beyond this physical life. Sadducees were also accepting of Greco-Roman culture. In short, they were religious secularists, having the apparent goal of securing their position of power while maintaining their religious political cult. In Jesus' time, Sadducees had considerable influence in the Sanhedrin and were closely aligned with the high priest, Joseph Caiaphas. Caiaphas himself was a Sadducee, Acts 5:17-18 and verse 33. The Pharisees. In Jesus' time, there were about 6,000 Pharisees. They were scholars dedicated to the understanding of the Hebrew law and oral traditions. They were generally well respected by the general public. Most interactions between Jesus and Pharisees in the New Testament were confrontational, with Jesus rebuking hypocritical attitudes and practices. Some Pharisees admired Jesus, however. Jesus often ate with Pharisees. At one point, Pharisees warned Jesus to leave Jerusalem, informing him of Herod Antipas's plan to kill him, Luke 13, verse 31. Nicodemus was a Pharisee and also a follower of Jesus. He was a Sanhedrin member since he was described as a member of the Jewish ruling council, John 3, verse 1. He initially visited Jesus secretly at night. Nicodemus' statement to Jesus was telling, quote, "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one could perform the miraculous signs that you do unless God is with him," end quote, John 3, verse 2. In saying, quote, "we know," end quote, Nicodemus revealed that there was a faction of Pharisees that privately embraced Jesus' teachings. Only 2 members of the Sanhedrin are directly named in the New Testament as followers of Jesus, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, Mark 15, verse 43. Members of the Sanhedrin were unwilling to publicly endorse Jesus for fear of being excommunicated from the synagogue, John 7:47-50, and John 12, verse 42. Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea at some point lost their shame of affiliating with Jesus. It was Nicodemus who purchased embalming accoutrements, and Joseph of Arimathea who purchased a linen shroud for Jesus' body. Together they took Jesus' body from the cross, wrapped it and placed it in a tomb, John 19:39-40, Luke 23, verse 53, and Mark 15, verse 46. The scribes. As the title indicates, scribes were originally copyists of the Hebrew law. With the destruction of Solomon's temple in 586 BC by the Babylonians, practice of the Jewish religion shifted away from priestly ceremonies associated with the temple to study of ethics and Hebrew law. Scribes assumed a prominent social role since they understood and could interpret the precepts of Hebrew law. Their social and religious prominence persisted in Jesus' time. Scribes were looked to as experts in the law and religious practices. They ranked alongside priests in terms of religious authority and understanding. In Jesus' time, many scribes were also priests. Jesus frequently found himself in confrontation jointly with both the scribes and Pharisees, Luke 11:52-54, and Mark 7:1-9. Scribes evidently had social prominence separate from the Pharisees but shared similar viewpoints, particularly about Jesus. The Zealots. One of Jesus' disciples was identified as being affiliated with a political faction called the Zealots, namely Simon the Zealot, Matthew 3, verse 18. The importance and influence of the Zealots should not be overlooked. The Zealot movement had a wide following. Josephus referred to the Zealots as a major philosophical school in first-century Judaism. His reference to Zealots being a major philosophical school reflects his Greco-Roman writing style for his intended Roman audience. It also speaks to the prominence and popularity of the Zealot movement within Israel, something Josephus deemed to be historically important. Josephus tied the blame for the 70 AD destruction of Jerusalem to the Zealot movement. To Roman thinking, Zealots were armed resistance fighters against Rome, and therefore thought of as generic criminals. To the Israelis, however, they were extreme religious conservatives. The beginnings of the Zealot faction is commonly traced to 6 AD when Judea became a Roman province, and a census was mandated by Quirinius, the legate, Roman governor of Syria, for the purpose of determining and mandating tax quotas. Judas of Galilee and a Pharisee named Sadduc organized a rebellion, their sentiment being that Israel was a theocracy. In their minds, to pay taxes and submit to the authority of a Gentile government was treasonous sacrilege since the king of Israel was God. Judas of Galilee is the only other zealot mentioned in the Bible apart from Jesus' disciple Simon the Zealot. Judas, however, died, presumed at the hands of the Romans, and his following dissipated, Acts 5, verse 37. The Zealot movement did not cease with the death of Judas, however. 2 of his sons were crucified as rebels. Judas's grandson, Eleazar, was a commander at the Jewish fortress of Masada when it was overrun by the Romans. The war with Rome was largely over after the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, but finally ended with the fall of Masada in 74 AD. Zealots were similar to Pharisees in terms of their conservative religious thinking. However, Zealots were unwilling to fold their hands and wait for God to deal with the Romans. They felt it was their divine duty to take matters into their own hands. Josephus referred to the zealots as sicarii, Latin for men armed with daggers, literally armed men or assassins. Pontius Pilate traditionally granted a gratuitous annual pardon at every Passover. He offered to release Jesus. However, the crowd demanded a man named Barabbas be released instead. Barabbas was a revolutionary, John 18, verse 40. He had been imprisoned with rebels who had committed murder during an insurrection, Mark 15, verse 7. The fact that the crowd would call upon Pilate to release Barabbas, apparently a zealot, speaks to the popularity of the zealots' resistance movement against Rome. Judas of Galilee and the 680 rebellion against Roman taxation was still within living memory in Jesus' time. It can be assumed that tensions over this issue remained high. This provides some insight regarding questions posed to Jesus about paying taxes to Caesar. From Matthew's Gospel, then the Pharisees went out and planned together to entrap him with his own words. They sent to him their disciples along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are truthful, and teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You do not court anyone's favor because you show no partiality. Tell us then, what do you think? Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" But Jesus realized their evil intentions and said, "Hypocrites! Why are you testing me? Show me the coin used for the tax." So they brought him a denarius. Jesus said to them, "Whose image is this, and whose inscription?" They replied, "Caesar's." He said to them, "Then give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." Now when they heard this, they were stunned, and they left him and went away. Matthew 22:15-22. The memory of Judas of Galilee and his armed rebellion made their questioning sensitive and politically charged. The Pharisees and Herodians attempted to ignite anger within the crowd by entrapping Jesus. Whatever the answer, yes or no, would have caused the crowd to react. Jesus perceived their trickery, however. Because of Jesus' rapidly growing popularity and his dynamic leadership, it is easy to understand how members of the Zealot movement would be attracted to him. They must have wondered if Jesus might be a leader from God, the Messiah, and the one to ultimately rid Israel of Roman occupation. Zealots would have been expecting the Messiah to be a military leader. The Messianic conundrum. How would you know the Messiah if you saw him? The term Messiah, meaning anointed one, harkens to the ceremonial anointing, which is pouring oil on the head, of a priest or king. The symbolism was well understood in Hebrew culture. The anointing ceremony signified a special endowment and appointment by God. It was a practice most applied to those in the office of a priest or king. Referring to an individual as the Messiah was uncommon, however, since it represented an appointment of profound significance. For example, Cyrus, the king of Persia, was referred to as a Messiah for his decree for the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, Isaiah 45, verse 1, Ezra 1, 1-4, and 2 Chronicles 36, 22-23. In Jesus' time, there was the hope of a coming leader, par excellence, a Messiah divinely gifted by God who would lead Israel and free them from Roman occupation. There were conflicting views of who that might be, however, or even whether there might be more than one person fulfilling the mission of Messiah. The Sadducees rejected the idea of a Messiah, but many Jews in Jesus' time had the expectation that a divinely appointed leader would come. The Messiah was expected to be a descendant of David, the slayer of Goliath and Israel's most famous historical king. In the Gospels, people often referred to Jesus as the Son of David, signifying their belief that Jesus was a descendant of King David, and the Messiah, Matthew 12, verse 23, and Luke 18, 37-39. Alternative viewpoints considered a possible Levitical or priestly Messiah. Many thought the Messiah would have the role of a major prophet, since Moses foretold that a prophet would come who would have unique and immense theological importance. John the Baptist was Jesus' cousin. He was the first person to publicly proclaim that Jesus was the Messiah, John 1:29-34. John was imprisoned for openly denouncing the illegitimate marriage of Herod Antipas. While in prison, John doubted. He sent messengers to ask Jesus if he truly was the Messiah. Luke 3, verse 19, Luke 7, 18-21. The duress of being in prison must have contributed to John's self-doubt about his proclamation that Jesus was the Messiah, but the lack of consensus about the messianic promise may have added to his doubt as well. Perhaps John also wondered if Jesus would become a military leader, expel the Romans, and become the king of Israel. Jesus responded to John by citing messianic prophecies from Isaiah, specifically passages stating that the Messiah's public ministry would be dedicated to the poor and associated with miraculous signs, Luke 7, verse 22, Isaiah 61, verse 1, and Isaiah 35, 5-6. Jesus offered John the Baptist spiritual reassurance by affirming that he was fulfilling Isaiah's messianic prophecies. The concept that the Messiah would be brutally tortured and killed was not in the thinking of most Jews in Jesus' time. 4 passages in the book of Isaiah, collectively referred to as the servant songs, are widely considered by Christians as prophetic descriptions of Jesus. However, in pre-Christian times, there was not a clear consensus to whom Isaiah was referring. Some considered the servant songs as figurative representations of the nation of Israel, while others felt the passages prophetically depicted a specific man. Yet, Isaiah's prophecy of a suffering servant in the servant songs seemed to refer to one man. However, parsing the nuances of Isaiah's prophecies would have been the domain of theologians of Jesus' day. Thus, a valiant Messiah who would vanquish the Romans must have been the most popular messianic hope of the common Israeli. Isaiah's servant songs present a strange prophetic dichotomy. They point to a man, a humble servant of God, who is blessed and exalted by God. Yet, he is despised and tortured by men, described as a man of sorrow, acquainted with grief and pain. Ultimately, he was killed for the transgressions of others, yet he himself was personally blameless. Through his suffering and death came healing and forgiveness. Jesus' followers were blind to the concept of a suffering Messiah, Mark 9, 31-32. To be sure, Israelis in Jesus' time were hoping for a Messiah and anticipated that he would liberate them from Roman occupation. Actually, the disciples bickered among themselves as to who would have the best appointments when Jesus set up his new government in Israel, Mark 9:34, Matthew 20:20-24. In another example of the disciples' lack of insight, Jesus walked and talked with 2 disciples traveling to the town of Emmaus later on the day of his resurrection. From Luke's Gospel, quote, "Then he, Jesus, said to them, 'What are these matters you are discussing so intently as you walk along?' And they stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, 'Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have happened there in these days?' He said to them, 'What things?' 'The things concerning Jesus the Nazarene,' they replied, 'a man who, with his powerful deeds and words, proved to be a prophet before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. Not only this, but it is now the 3rd day since these things happened. Furthermore, some women of our group amazed us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body, they came back and said they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him. So Jesus said to them, 'You foolish people, how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Wasn't it necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and enter into his glory?' Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things written about himself in all the scriptures." End quote. Luke 24, 17-27. Cleopas stated that he, as well as other followers of Jesus, had hoped that he, Jesus, was the one who was going to redeem Israel. They believed Jesus was the Messiah, but thought that he would liberate the Jews from Roman domination and reestablish Israel as a theocratic nation-state. The concept of a suffering Messiah was unimaginable. It was Jesus himself who taught Cleopas and his companion that the Messiah would suffer torture and death. Cleopas went immediately to tell the other disciples of their meeting with Jesus and what he told them. The disciples simply could not let go of the expectation that Jesus would establish a theocracy in Israel and free them from the Romans. Moments before Jesus ascended into heaven, the disciples asked, quote, "Lord, is this the time when you are restoring the kingdom to Israel?" End quote. Acts 1 verse 6. Meeting the resurrected Jesus convinced them that he was the Messiah. It must have seemed obvious that the Messiah would now emerge as the military and political leader of Israel. The greater significance of Jesus' role as the Messiah was not yet fully understood. In summary, in Jesus' time, Israel was a hotbed of political unrest. The political players were many. Jewish rulers walked a tightrope to maintain favor with Rome, quell local unrest, and preserve their positions of power and wealth. Someone like Jesus, a charismatic young leader with a meteoric rise in popularity, could be seen as a threat to the political balance. If Rome came to believe Jesus' popularity represented a threat of insurgency, they would act with swift and overpowering force. Discontent within the general population fueled hope for a messianic deliverer and made the political climate potentially volatile. Beliefs about who the Messiah was may have varied, but the unifying expectation was that the Messiah would free Israel from Roman occupation. A growing public consensus that Jesus could be that Messiah made those in the Israeli religious political hierarchy nervous. Jesus' popularity was growing at an alarming rate. The Pharisees said to one another, quote, "You see that you can do nothing. Look, the world has run off after him." End quote. John 12, verse 19. At one point, Jesus had to escape to nearby mountains to keep the crowds from forcibly crowning him King of Israel, John 6, verse 15. Killing Jesus seemed necessary to preserve the status quo. At least, that was the conclusion of the Sanhedrin. From John's Gospel, chapter 11, "So the chief priests and the Pharisees called the council together and said, 'What are we doing? For this man is performing many miraculous signs. If we allow him to go on in this way, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away our sanctuary and our nation.' Then one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said, 'You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is more to your advantage to have one man die for the people than for the whole nation to perish.' John 11:47-50. So from that day they planned together to kill him. John 11, verse 53.